and welcome back to Imagination Mansion. Today I thought I'd do something that I did last year, because I quite like this being like a yearly thing, which is basically going through everything that I read in 2023. There's quite a few more that I have this year than I did last year, so I'm basically going to go through everything in the order that I read them. Not gonna lie, this is mostly non-fiction, though there are some fiction worked in here and there, and yeah, I'll just go through them. First up, we start the year with a reread, which is Dan Brown, Angels and Demons. I really like him. I really especially like the Robert Langdon series. I love him as a protagonist. I just love the adventures that they go on, maybe because he's a professor, so they're very history and, you know, literature and all that kind of stuff. Because with this one, there's literally a point where they have to find a book in the Vatican Library. So that is definitely up my alley for like a mystery novel. So I love that. So that's what started me off in the year. A good strong start for me, I believe. Next up, we have The Florentines, From Dante to Galileo, which is this one. So yeah, as it says, this is essentially a book about all the sort of like revolution of Renaissance that happened in Florence and kind of like the people that were like the biggest players in that. It was really good. I kind of wish he'd written like a specific book on each of the people, because it really felt like we didn't have enough space to get to know everyone. But the information he gave was good, and I did like it as an overview. So next up, we have another fiction, a kid's book this time, which is The Valley of Lost Secrets by Leslie Parr. I was quite surprised at how much I liked this one, but it's essentially the story of kids who have been evacuated during World War II, and they end up sort of like in the valleys, and they find this mystery, and it's just about these kids, you know, from the city in the countryside solving this mystery, and the kind of story that goes along with that, and the families that they're kind of being looked after by, and how they're all entwined. And I really enjoyed it. So that's that one. Next up is Other Lands by Thomas Halliday. This one. So this was really interesting because he basically talks about like the way that the Earth was in certain time periods, and he does it backwards in time, which is a really fascinating way of doing it. And then he does kind of have like an ecological message at the end of it, being like, please can we look after the planet? Which honestly is a good message to give, because we do need to. We have been quite careless with it, and now's the time to like let it revive itself. But it was very, very good. Really enjoyed it. Very good writing style, very much. You know, if you know this is kind of your jam, absolutely give it a read. It's a great science book. Next up, we have a very strange edition of a classic, which is Paradise Lost by John Milton, or if you read the side, Charlotte Perkins Milton. I have no idea how this got printed. To be fair, the inside is all correct. It's just like a really weird edition. To be fair, I bought it in the charity shop for like £1.50, and so, you know, can't really complain. And apparently it was just like printed by Amazon. So the actual contents, brilliant. Can see why it's a classic. Very, very interesting take on sort of like the fall of man in the Garden of Eden and all that kind of stuff. Very fascinating read. And that's that one. Next up, completely 180, is Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence by Max Tegmark. So this was really, really fascinating because it was talking about, yes, you know, like AI and all that kind of stuff, but about how we're not quite taking it seriously, and how we've ended up in two very juxtaposed positions of there's nothing to worry about at all, and the Terminator is going to happen. And it's like, no, we should be somewhere in the middle, like maybe a bit more to this side, like maybe more cautious, but definitely somewhere in the middle. And it's sort of like advocating for checking what computers will do, what the technology can do, especially when it starts just updating itself by itself, and you know, the kind of things that we need to put in place for that. If you're into AI and computer technology and all that kind of stuff, definitely a brilliant read. Next up, another 180 again. There's a lot of that in there. I do kind of just, I'm very much a mood reader, but with non-fiction, so I will just pick up books on a topic that sounds interesting even if it's completely different to what I've read before, is A Wood of One's Own by Ruth Pavey. So this is the story about a woman, Ruth, who basically buys a plot of land and decides to try and build a woodland on it. And it's very interesting to hear the story of what kind of things go into that, and you know, the trials and tribulations and legislation and all that kind of stuff. And it's very well written and a very interesting book. And I also just love the cover. It's very pretty. Like, she's got like her illustrations inside as well, which is very nice. So flying back to physics, and we have Physics of the Future by Michio Kaku. So it's interesting because like one of the time periods that he's talking about is like near future, which is present to 2030, which is not that far off. Which is scary to think about, though this was written in 2012, where it's a bit further away. Some of the things that he's written about haven't come true, and unfortunately probably won't in the next 5 years, which is a bit of a shame. He is quite an optimist, but I kind of love that about him, and he's just so excited in everything that he writes. And honestly, like, he could waffle on about something that I'm completely uninterested in, and I'd still listen, because it's just so nice to hear like academic writers just be so hype about the thing that they're talking about, which is I think why I quite like non-fiction, because you basically just get to read someone nerd out for like however long it takes to read that book, and it's great. Next up we have Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. How fungi make our worlds, change our minds and shape our futures. Just a big book about mushrooms, to be honest. And I loved it. I've got the sprayed edge version, which is very, very bright red. I loved this book. It was so fascinating. Like, the fact that, you know, fungi is somewhere between plant and animal, we keep struggling to like figure out what it is, and how all of its processes are so complicated and parasitic sometimes, and then they do this, they do that, they talk to each other and all this kind of stuff. And the fact that you can have a group grow, throw tendrils like across a bridge and then start growing again on the other side, which is one of the examples he gives, is just so fascinating. And yes, he does go into magic mushrooms at one point, and it's a really interesting discussion that he has on that as well. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. And they've brought out like a big illustrated version of this now, which I am tempted to get and which I would highly recommend. So next up we have a did not finish for me, which is Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. So this was in the nature section, and it felt like it should have been in the biography section. In of itself, it was technically a well-written book, but it was more of a biography, whereas I went into it thinking I'd be finding out research about the mother tree, and that does come into it, but it's kind of drip fed through. And like, the woman was going through a lot at the time, and so it's kind of understandable, but I wasn't quite ready for that. Like, I wasn't expecting to have her biography, I was just kind of expecting to have her research, with maybe little bits dripped in here and there about her life, but it literally got to the point where I gave up, even though when I started reading it I was fascinated about what is the mother tree, what is it all about. I kind of lost interest by about halfway through because it was mostly just her life. And like I said, she was going through it and she was having a tough time, but that's not why I bought the book. Which might sound harsh, but you know, when you're going in expecting a book all about trees and you get some trees and mostly like personal drama, it's difficult. So I did end up dropping it about halfway through. And if I end up being intrigued about what she was talking about, I will probably see if I can find her research paper on it, rather than trying to finish the book. So next up, we have another one of the rare fiction books that are in this pile, Guild by Raven Kennedy, which is part of the Plated Prisoner series. So this is book 1. I have bought book 2. I have yet to read it. I did find this really interesting. It's basically the tale of King Midas, but given a completely different mythical world to go along with it. Instead of like ancient Greece, she's like invented a whole new place. which was very interesting to read, and I did quite enjoy it. So I will probably be reading book 2. And that's that one. Next up is, we're swapping from fantasy to sci-fi. It is Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, and this is the first of the Cosmic trilogy. I loved this. I really like old science fiction, so Jules Verne and H.G. Wells are my absolute favourite. C.S. Lewis, who is obviously famous for Chronicles of Narnia and also faith essays, did a brilliant job with this one, and I will absolutely probably be buying the 2 sequels. Because this was absolutely fantastic, and if you are a fan of like the classics, or even if you're not, this is just a brilliant read. Like, it's just so interesting, and there are some like moral tales in there, but overall just a great book. Next up we have The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole, and I just love that he's called Shrubsole and he's writing about trees. Anyway, I love this book, very good book. I didn't know we had rainforests in this country, but apparently we do. And the reason why we don't know about it is because we don't have many, and they are very dinky, and they've mostly been cut down by like Industrial Revolution people. So what we have left, we need to look after. So definitely an interesting read, especially if, like me, you didn't know we had any. So that's that one. Next up is, on a similar vein, is Wild Fell by Lee Schofield. And this is basically quite close to home, because this is basically them trying to rewild Haweswater, which is in the Lake District, which is like my neighbourhood, well, in Cumbria, which is where I live. It's about them trying to rewild, and kind of the conflict and finagling they've had to do with like local farmers and stuff, because this is a very like sheep farming heavy area, and obviously a lot of people don't want to let go of that because it's all they've known, and it is kind of them having to like work with the neighbours and be like, no, this is a good thing, it will help, we promise, and kind of trying to do their best to run their farm while not annoying the neighbours. But it was absolutely an interesting read to see all the little bits and pieces that they were doing. So that's that one. So next up we have Brief Answers to the Big Questions by Stephen Hawking. I read this all in one go and just before bed, which would not advise, especially if you are someone who is a deep thinker and has existential crises, because oh boy will this give you a big one. But it is well written, and it's very interesting because it's one of those things where even if you do not agree with the points that he's making, like, you know, he does talk about difficult topics like religion and stuff like that. So even if you don't agree, it's still fascinating to read. Next up, we have one of the few behemoths, which is The Rise and Reign of the Mammals by Steve Brusatte. So I read his book on dinosaurs, and it was very good. So I kind of knew I liked his writing style. And this is kind of the parallel story to that, but about how the mammals like were the underdogs, and then obviously when the dinosaurs struggled, we kind of took over, and the way that we did that, and sort of like the creations that came along the way, and like how that happened. And it's just a very, very interesting read. That one. So next up we have Quantum Supremacy by, once again, Michio Kaku. Didn't think I was that interested in quantum computers, to be honest. I didn't know anything about them. I kind of heard about them just because like I do follow physics people, and so it is kind of in that family. But like I said before, if he's writing about it, I'm gonna be interested in it just because he's just so interested in like everything, and so I knew it would be good if he was writing it, and so I did enjoy the book. Will not lie, did not understand everything he was talking about. I am not particularly like tech inclined, so some of it did go over my head, but absolutely if it is a topic of interest for you, this is a great place to start. It is so interesting. So another behemoth is An Immense World by Ed Yong, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us. So it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's essentially talking about all the different senses that animals have that maybe we don't, or they're in different areas, or they're heightened in different places and limited in others. and just the way that that means that their world is very different to ours. And it was honestly just so well written and so interesting that I did, even though it's quite a large one, read it quite quickly. So that's that one. Also, the cover is just really cool. I really like it. A sort of classic book that I came about a lot later than I think a lot of people did is The Little Book of Hygge, The Danish Way to Live Well. So I read this and it was very, very interesting to basically read it and go, oh, this is how I live or how I want to live my life. I like cozy things. My preference is winter. In terms of seasons, I like big fuzzy jumpers, scarves, big coats, you know, warm cups of tea and a good book, as you can tell from this video. So it was very, very interesting to see that this is a thing, that like the coziness and all that kind of stuff, because I wasn't really aware of it when it blew up, which was I think 2016, so I am very late to the game. But yeah, it was an interesting read. So next up we have Atomic Habits by James Clear. So this is quite popular in like the self-help area, and I found it very, very interesting. It's definitely a way to look at things, and habit stacking and prioritizing is definitely something that I will consider. Don't think everything in here will work for me, but it's absolutely interesting in the topics that it brings up and the way that it suggests to go about things. Next up is The Sustainable-ish Living Guide, Everything You Need to Know to Make Small Changes That Make a Big Difference by Jen Gale. So if you watched my video last year, you will know that this gave me a slight existential crisis, but I think I had to remember, yes, I need to think about it, but sometimes, especially like living out in the countryside, we don't have that much access to like the the fancy brands that have the more sustainable stuff. We have kind of the dregs of, yeah, the fast fashion and the cheap plastic and all that kind of stuff. Like, we have a lot of charity shops, to be fair, so that I was absolutely able to do. But it is just being aware and being like, okay, I'll make the decisions when I can, because obviously a lot of sustainable stuff is a lot more expensive. And so if you can't, you know, buy, you know, like the fancy organic green eco stuff, what you can do is do the best with what you have. And I think that's the thing to take away is like, yeah, okay, you might have to buy that 15 quid coat from Primark, but make it last. Because then it's not fast fashion anymore. It's going to last you a while. As long as you don't chuck it out as soon as it gets to winter and learn how to sew, which is something I do need to get better at. I do have a sewing kit and I do have like a box of things I need to fix. I just need to fix them. Maybe that's what 2024 is going to be. Me fixing my old clothes. Next up, we have Self-Care for Tough Times, How to Heal in Times of Anxiety, Loss and Change by Susie Redding. This is quite simple, and it is technically just a more tips and tricks books rather than obviously things like Atomic Habits that goes into a lot more depth, like more this kind of stuff. But it's absolutely, I found it quite helpful for like if I'm getting stressed at work or I'm dealing with a difficult situation with my family or something like that, and just looking after myself so I'm not surprised when, you know, I'm exhausted even though nothing big happened to me. Because I think that's the thing I have sometimes is like, I'm like, why am I so stressed? Nothing's happened. And it's like, yeah, nothing big's happened, but a bunch of teeny tiny things has happened and you haven't dealt with any of them, so yes, you are stressed. So even though it says like for tough times, even if you don't know you're going through a tough time, it's still very helpful. Next up, we have a classic children's book, which is How to Train Your Dragon by Cressida Cowell. I loved this. It was very good. I will probably be buying the sequels. Although I might see if there's like a different edition, because I'm gonna say I wasn't that keen on the illustrations. Although I don't know if every edition has the illustrations in them. I don't know why. You know when things just kind of like creep you out, but there's no specific reason, it's just kind of like, ugh. I was a bit like that. But the actual story, absolutely loved it. Obviously it's not really anything like the film, and I went into it knowing that, so I wasn't disappointed. So yeah, really enjoyed it. Next up, we have another Hygge book, which is My Hygge Home, How to Make Your Home Your Happy Place, by once again Mick Viking. This was really good actually. It's very interesting. It sort of like talks about things that you wouldn't think about, like lighting and eating at the dinner table and making sure you actually go to bed at the right time and choosing like softer textures instead of like bright white everything. So yeah, if you're finding your house stressful, definitely a good read. Next up, we have Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries by Kate Moss. So this was really interesting. It is exactly what it says on the tin. It's about how women built the world. And it's basically about all the women from, yeah, queens to, you know, the sort of like little guy that helped the world be the way it is. Basically, all the women that built up sort of like different things, different sectors. Like it's got, you know, suffragettes and all that kind of stuff, but then it's also got scientists and writers and aviators and all this kind of stuff. And it's just a very interesting read. And it was also interesting because it was a personal story for her as well, because she's looking for her grandmother. She's writing sort of like a personal story of finding one of her ancestors as well. But yeah, really enjoyed it, especially if you're interested in like women's history. Next up, a very different type of history book, The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon by Stephanie Daly. So this was a lot smaller than I was expecting to be, but I was quite glad of that because it's not too complicated, which I truly appreciate. You know, it's not bogged down in jargon or over-explaining or under-explaining. It includes pictures where needed, it clarifies things, and it's honestly just so interesting to like see what people got right and what people got wrong in terms of like making it a wonder of the world and all this kind of stuff. And so yeah, it's just a very interesting book. We have a fantasy book, which is The Night and Its Moon by Piper CJ. So I loved this book. It was really good. I just loved the story, I loved the characters, I loved the world building, and I have the sequel for this. I am quite sad that it comes with a different paper now, which sounds so little, but I think because like it wasn't as popular when this came out, so it's kind of got that sort of like really compact soft paper, and then the sequel's got kind of like more, I guess, more like this normal paper. Like you can hear the difference. But yeah, it was still really good, and I will absolutely be reading the sequel at some point. Next up is Sci-Fi, which is Artemis by Andy Ware. I really enjoyed this, and I enjoyed the sort of intrigue in what it would actually be like to live on a moon base and how the heck you would police that, and the kind of like hijinks that you would get up to, and sort of like how they would deal with any like, you know, like smugglers or criminals or any of that kind of stuff. It was very, very interesting. Next up, we've got a book that I finally got round to after it being on my shelf for years, which is Ancestors by Professor Alice Roberts. So this was really interesting. It is the prehistory of Britain in 7 burials, and its prehistory is one of my interests, and it was just so fascinating to read about these graves and what they might mean, and sort of like where they came from, and kind of the history of how they were categorized through the years and how those things have changed as technology has improved and all that kind of stuff. And it was just so interesting. So that's that one. Next up is another fantasy book, which is A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair, and it's a Hades and Persephone story. So I loved this book, and it was so interesting, the world building of it, of kind of like having the gods in like a new Athens where they are basically like celebrities, and that was really fascinating. There is technically a sequel, but I kind of like the way that this ended, so I might not end up getting that. But all in all, as a whole story, really enjoyed it. It's quite a slow build up to the relationship, but I don't mind that. I just really liked it. That's that one. Next up is a light novel, which is Sword Art Online Aincrad, Volume 1. I loved the anime, and I've also read I kind of accidentally read Progressive before I read this, and Progressive is basically filling in the gaps. Basically just the author adding more bits and pieces that he personally found interesting. I love the story. Like I said, I've loved the anime for years. One of my faves, and I really enjoyed the light novel of it. So that's that one. Next up is another fiction, which is 4 Seasons in Japan by Nick Bradley. What's this one? So it's essentially a story of a translator in Japan who's kind of struggling in her life, and so kind of to distract herself from it, she finds this book just left on a train and she just starts translating it. And a big chunk of the story is the story she's translating, and then another part of it is her trying to find the author so that she can kind of get permission to publish it. But it was really fascinating, and I will not lie, I preferred the story that she was writing to her story, but I think that's just due to the fact that the translated story was such a bigger part than hers was. But yeah, loved it. It was really good. So Make Viking is back again with The Little Book of Luca? I'm not sure how you pronounce this one, but it's basically just like the book of happiness. And what makes people happy in different places, and the kind of things that delegate sort of like that keep popping up again and again. So the chapter titles are literally togetherness, money, health, freedom, trust, kindness, and then putting the pieces together. So it's all the things, people that you spend your time with, how many people, how often, the type of activities you do, so like the strength of your bonds and all that kind of stuff. So it was very, very fascinating, especially living in an age where we don't really talk to our neighbours or anyone else. And it was like, oh, maybe that's why we're all so sad, because we don't communicate with our community anymore. But definitely eye-opening and definitely interesting. Next up, we have another Professor Alice Roberts with Buried, an alternative history of the first millennium in Britain. So it's once again going through burials, but it's specifically centered on the first millennium, and it's definitely interesting to see what similarities there were between graves, the complete differences, what this might mean in terms of people coming in from different places, or just differences between territories, and where people move to, and how much they can tell with technology nowadays. And it was just, yeah, very, very fascinating and a very interesting read. Next up, got something a bit different, which is Following in the Footsteps of King Arthur. So that's basically a list of all the places that the myth of Arthur is attributed to. So it sort of gives a brief introduction to where the myth came from and all the different authors that are associated with it. And then, yeah, it's got like all the places that have kind of been highlighted as places where these bits of the myth may have taken place. Camelot may have been, where his death place may have been, where his birthplace may have been, and all the places in between, like where was the Round Table, where were his knights, where was the Lady in the Lake, all this kind of stuff. So it is what it says on the tin. It is just a description of all the different places that may be involved, and it was quite fascinating to see sort of like the range of places that people have attributed to this. And yeah, it was just very, very interesting. So that's that one. Next up is The Penguin Book of Exorcisms by Penguin. This was a little underwhelming, I'm not going to lie. I think the only ones that seemed like actual exorcisms were like the full-on modern ones. So like basically like this bit of the book. The rest of it was just kind of like, I don't know, it was, I guess I was just expecting, like, look at the illustration on the front. You're expecting some like exorcism stuff, right? And no, it was a lot more just mundane, honestly. And I was like, kind of just worked my, because I did finish it, but it was a bit of a slog and I did find it quite boring. That's that one. Next up is Carlo Rovelli, Helgoland, which is talking about the birth of quantum physics, which was very fascinating to read, sort of like how it all came about just on this little island. It was so fascinating, and It does get into quantum physics, which can get a bit existential. So I think I described it as the most poetic existential crisis I have ever had, because if you've ever read Carlo Rovelli, he is beautifully gifted at writing words, and it's just so poetic, even though what he is talking about is sort of like applied mathematics. But truly a brilliant read. Absolutely loved it. Next up is Men Without Women by Murakami. So this is one of his collections of short fiction, and I loved it, as I usually do his writings. He is one of my favourite authors, and is just sort of like men who find themselves like alone for whatever reason, and how odd that can make them, or just how their lives end up being because of that. And you know, it's Murakami, so it is slightly surreal, but I love it. It's very, very good. Next up was an interesting one. So this was one I found at a charity shop, which is Flowers of Emptiness by Sally Belfridge. Or Belfridge? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's this one. And it's essentially about, well, because it's a non-fiction, so it's literally about this woman's journey into India with her friends who've kind of like been indoctrinated into sort of like this guru lifestyle in India, and it's just looking at the difference between these sort of like areas where it's supposed to be all enlightenment and spirituality and all that kind of stuff, and then literally on their doorstep is like slums and things like that, and the kind of disconnect that a lot of these people feel, but also kind of admiring some of the lessons that the gurus are preaching. And so it was very, very interesting. Next up we have another Murakami, but a non-fiction this time, which is What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. The only book that's ever come close to getting me to do major exercise. But I love this book. I love how he sort of equates running and writing, and about how with both of them he just kind of decided to start doing it because why not? Which was really interesting, and also just kind of fits. Like I read that and went, yeah, that makes sense for him. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But it's definitely, and because it's a biography, and it's a very interesting autobiography, and definitely very much him, if that makes sense. But yeah, that one. Next up is quite a niche one, which is The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland Allen. I loved this book. It was fantastic. I have never given that much thought to my notebooks, of which you can see my collection over here. Never given it that much thought, but to see how they came about and how they became popular was so interesting. So yeah, it's just, you know, how it started with like tablets, and as in like stone tablets, and wax things that you could wipe clean and all this kind of stuff, and you know, the traveler's notebook, and you know, it even goes all the way up to bullet journaling and stuff like that. So it was absolutely a fascinating read, and if that's a topic of interest for you, I advise this book. It's great. Last but not least, which was the perfect book to read at the end of the season, was Deck the Hall by Andrew Gant. The stories of our favourite Christmas carols. This was really interesting to read, partially because a lot of the Christmas carols I had not heard of. Some of them I had, like the Coventry Carol, but then I've never heard of Infant Holy or Christians Awake. So there were some of them that I was like, I have never heard of this, but it was still so fascinating to find out that the church never used to like carols. They used to be seen as like weird, but then they kind of made their way from like outside the church to the inside of the church, which was very, very fascinating. And about how they kind of like were conflated between like sometimes like 3 different places that got like mushed together, and about how some started out as folk songs, how some had like the tune written in England and then the words written in America, or vice versa, and it was just very interesting. So if you like Christmas carols, it's a good book to read. So that was all the books I read in 2023. There were quite a few, not quite sure how many. I'm not gonna count them. I'm not that good at counting. But there was a lot. I think there was a couple of others that I read, but they were ones that I borrowed either from the library or for work or for whatever. So I don't have them here, but I think the number was roughly around like 43. But yeah, I loved most of these books, and I definitely enjoy reading books on different topics. I don't believe in having to force myself to stick to one topic or one genre or anything like that, and I've got plenty more to read. I have a lot of books. I do still need to catalogue them at some point. I keep trying to, and then because I have so many, and because I've recently started buying them again, yeah, I just kind of go, it's too hard, and stop. So that is still something that I need to do and have not done yet. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys have been reading last year, or what you want to read this year, have been reading this year. I recently just finished a giant book on manuscripts, which was 509 pages long. Like, I looked up, because you can, like, if you like search up like how big the book is, it also gives you the weight, and it was apparently 750 grams. That is a large bag of sugar. So no wonder I had to basically lay it down on my desk and prop it open because it's just so heavy. But yeah, I've read that one. I've read a book on clocks. I've also, what else have I read this year? Oh, I've read a book on Britain, specifically British religion while the Romans were here. So yeah, that's Roman Britain, clockwork, and manuscripts. So we're sticking with the eclectic theme, not on purpose. It's just what I vibe with at the time. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, I'm thinking I might actually make videos on like specific topics. So if you've got any like non-fiction topics that you'd be interested in, I will happily see if I've got enough books to make like a genre specific video. I'd say with fiction, less so, because basically all I have in fiction is fantasy and sci-fi with the occasional like speculative fiction. So I think that one would be difficult, but definitely like, you know, ancient history, space, geography, women's history, mythology, all that kind of stuff, I can probably do a video on. So if you're interested in any of those topics, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But yeah, so subscribe if you want to see that and see more from me. I do streams on Twitch on a Sunday. At the moment I am playing Hades. I've only just gotten to the point where I can actually reach Hades without dying, though it still takes me a few deaths to get there. So we're not quite at like pro gamer level yet, but I'm getting pretty good considering I'm WASDing the game, and apparently it wasn't intended for WASD. So yeah, that'll be fun. So on a Sunday I do that. I do have a little VTuber thing, just simply because it's usually like 10, 11 o'clock on a Sunday and you don't want to see what I look like at that point. But yeah, so I'll put a link to that in the description. And yeah, I'll see you next time.